The plant scientist's name was Dr. Yusuf Baker, and he worked for NASA's Kennedy Space Center in the Exploration Research and Technology Directorate on a program most people had never heard of, the Advanced Plant Habitat Research Initiative, which was developing closed-loop agricultural systems for long-duration space missions. The work was, in the simplest terms, about figuring out how to grow food in places where water was the most constrained resource in the entire system. A lunar greenhouse, a Mars transit vehicle, anywhere that every gram of water had to be accounted for and recycled and could not simply be replenished from a well or a river or rainfall. Yusuf had spent 11 years on wheat specifically. Wheat was a candidate crop for long-duration missions because it was calorically dense, nutritionally complete in ways few crops were, and had a long history of breeding for different conditions. But the breeding programs that had produced modern high-yield wheat varieties had optimized for conditions that were the opposite of what a closed-loop space habitat could provide: high water availability, high light, large root volumes. Modern wheat was bred to perform well when resources were abundant. NASA needed wheat that performed well when resources were scarce and exactly accounted for. He had spent 11 years testing varieties against a specific metric: grams of edible protein produced per liter of water consumed, under controlled deficit conditions that simulated what a closed-loop system could actually supply. Most modern varieties performed poorly under this metric. Their yield advantages depended on water inputs that a closed-loop system could not provide. Older varieties, land races, and regional heirloom lines sometimes performed better because they had been selected over generations by farmers working in conditions where water actually was scarce and could not be supplemented. He had been working through a list of candidate heirloom varieties identified through USDA germplasm collections and university extension contacts. In March 2023, an extension agronomist in Hill County, Montana had mentioned, almost in passing, during a phone call about something else entirely, that there was a farmer outside Havre who grew an old hard red winter wheat variety that the neighbors thought was a joke because of how little water it used and how the farmer refused to switch to anything modern despite 40 years of being told he was leaving yield on the table. Yusuf had asked the agronomist to send him a seed sample. The sample had arrived in April. Yusuf had run it through the deficit irrigation protocol in May. The results had come back in June. He had run the test again in July because he had not believed the June results. The July results matched the June results. He had booked a flight to Montana for August. Earl Voss was 76 years old and farmed 1,100 acres of dryland wheat on the high plains east of Havre, in the part of Hill County where the Rocky Mountain front was a blue line on the western horizon, and the wind came across the wheat in a way that, depending on the season, either helped or hurt, and mostly there was nothing you could do about which. He had taken over the operation from his father Walter in 1968, and Walter had taken it over from his father Henrik, who had homesteaded the land in 1911 after emigrating from a region of Russia near the Volga River, where German-speaking farming communities had been growing wheat in semi-arid conditions for over a century before the Soviet period disrupted those communities and scattered them, some to Montana and the Dakotas and Kansas, where the climate, though not identical, was similar enough that the wheat varieties these immigrants brought with them often performed better in the northern plains than the varieties American breeders had been working with. Henrik had brought seed, not much, what fit in a small cloth sack, the way immigrants in that period often carried seed for crops that mattered to them, because seed was small and light and represented an investment of selection and adaptation that could not be easily replaced. The wheat Henrik brought was a hard red winter wheat that his family had been growing in the Volga German communities for at least several generations before him, a variety that had been selected across those generations for survival in a climate that received less rainfall than almost anywhere else in Europe where wheat was grown at scale. Henrik had planted the seed on his Montana homestead in 1912. It had performed well, not spectacularly in good years, but consistently in all years, including the years that broke other farmers' crops. Henrik had kept the variety going. Walter had kept it going. Earl had kept it going. By the 1980s, Earl had been the only farmer in Hill County still growing this specific variety. Everyone else had transitioned to the modern hard red winter varieties that university breeding programs had developed. Varieties with higher yield potential under good conditions. Varieties that performed better in the kind of years when rainfall was adequate and a farmer wanted to maximize output. Earl's wheat did not perform better in those years. In a good year, his yield was noticeably lower than his neighbors. This had been a source of mild but persistent local commentary for 40 years. Not hostile exactly, but the kind of commentary that accumulated over decades in a farming community where everyone knew everyone's yields and everyone had opinions about how everyone else farmed. Earl had heard variations of the same observation for 40 years. "You're leaving yield on the table, Earl. That old variety's had its day. You could be getting 20% more in a good year if you switched." Earl's response had also been consistent for 40 years. He had said more or less the same thing every time. "It doesn't fail in a bad year." He had said, "I've been farming since 1968. I've had," he would do the count, slightly different depending on when the conversation happened. 15 years, 18 years, 20 years, however many it had been by that point, where this wheat was the only thing that made a crop at all, because the rain didn't come and the modern varieties around me failed. He had said, "I'll take consistent over occasionally spectacular." He had said, "My grandfather's family learned that the hard way, somewhere a long time ago, and they didn't forget it, and neither will I." Yusuf had driven from the Havre airport to the Voss farm on a Wednesday in August, the wheat already harvested for the season, the stubble fields stretching toward the mountains in the particular gold-brown of late-summer Montana high plains. Earl had met him at the gate. He was a broad man, weathered, with the specific build of someone who had spent 55 years doing physical agricultural work, wearing a seed company cap that was at least a decade old and faded past the point of advertising anything, work pants, and a canvas jacket, despite the August warmth, because the wind off the front made canvas a reasonable choice, even in summer. He had said, "You're the NASA fellow." Yusuf had said, "Yes." Earl had said, "The extension office called me a few months back, said someone wanted seed samples for some kind of testing." He had said, "I sent what they asked for. Didn't think much more about it." Yusuf had said, "The results were significant." He had said, "Significant enough that I wanted to see the operation in person." Earl had looked at him for a moment. He had said, "Significant how?" Yusuf had explained the metric. Protein produced per liter of water, under deficit conditions. He had explained the comparison set. Dozens of varieties tested over 11 years, most of them performing in a predictable range. He had said, "Your variety outperforms every other sample in the comparison set, not marginally, by a wide margin." He had said, "It's the best result I've recorded in 11 years of this program." Earl had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "For what, exactly?" Yusuf had explained the Advanced Plant Habitat Program, closed-loop agriculture, lunar and Mars mission planning, the specific constraint of water in a system where every input had to be accounted for and recycled. Earl had listened to all of this with an expression that Yusuf, who had given versions of this explanation many times to many people, recognized as a specific kind of attention. Not skepticism, not excitement, but the attention of someone absorbing information and fitting it into a framework they already had. When Yusuf finished, Earl had said, "My grandfather's family grew this wheat in a place where it didn't rain enough, for longer than anybody could remember, until they couldn't stay there anymore for other reasons." He had said he brought what fit in a sack, and what he chose to bring was wheat that didn't need much water, because that's what mattered where they were going. He had said, "I didn't know anything about the moon when I decided to keep growing it." He had said, "I knew it didn't fail when the rain didn't come. That was the whole reason." He had looked out at the stubble fields toward the mountains. He had said, "I suppose that's the same problem in a way, not having enough water and needing the crop to make it anyway." Yusuf had said, "Yes, that's exactly the problem." The variety's genetic background had not been formally documented before Yusuf's analysis. Earl knew the family story. Henrik, the Volga German community, the sack of seed, the 1912 planting. But the variety itself had never been entered into any USDA germplasm collection or university breeding programs records. It existed, as far as any formal record was concerned, only in Earl's fields and in the small amount of seed Earl kept in reserve each year. Enough for replanting plus a margin, the way his father and grandfather had always kept a margin. Because a farmer who grew the same variety for over a century did not buy seed from anyone. Yusuf had asked whether Earl would be willing to have the variety formally characterized, genetic sequencing, agronomic trials at multiple research stations, entry into the USDA germplasm system where it would be preserved and made available for further research. He had explained that this was standard practice for any variety NASA's program identified as significant, not because NASA would commercialize it, but because a variety this useful needed to exist in more than one farmer's bins, in case anything ever happened to that farmer's operation. Earl had thought about this for a while. He had said, "My family's kept this going for over 100 years without anyone else needing to know about it." He had said, "I'm not opposed to other people knowing about it. I just want to understand what it means, practically, for how I farm." Yusuf had said, "Practically, it means almost nothing changes for you. You keep growing it the way you've always grown it. What changes is that samples go into research collections, and agronomists at a few land-grant universities run trials with it under various conditions, and the data gets published." He had said, "Your name would be associated with it as the source." Earl had said, "My grandfather's name should be associated with it. He brought it here. I just didn't stop." Yusuf had said, "We can document it that way. The convention is usually to credit the variety's documented source, and you're the documented source. But the family history can be part of the record." Earl had said, "Good." He had said, "Henrik Voss. He brought it from somewhere near the Volga in 1911, and he was scared and broke, and he had a sack of seed, because that seed was the one thing he was sure would still work, wherever he ended up." He had said, "That should be in the record too." Yusuf had written this down. The agronomic trials had been established at 3 land-grant university research stations: Montana State, North Dakota State, and a USDA research station in eastern Washington that worked on dry-land cropping systems. In the spring following Yusuf's visit, the trials had been designed to test the variety under a range of deficit irrigation conditions, comparing it against both modern commercial varieties and several other heirloom lines from the USDA's existing germplasm collection. The results, published in the spring of the following year in a peer-reviewed agronomy journal, confirmed Yusuf's initial findings and extended them. The variety formally entered into the USDA germplasm system under the designation Voss 1912, reflecting both the family name and the year of the original Montana planting, showed a water use efficiency under severe deficit conditions that exceeded every other variety in the comparison set by a margin the paper's authors described, in the careful language of agronomy journals, as substantial and consistent across all 3 trial locations. The paper's discussion section included a paragraph that was unusual for an agronomy journal, addressing the variety's origin. It noted that the line had been maintained in continuous cultivation by a single farming family for over 110 years, without institutional support or formal breeding intervention, through selection pressures that had not been documented. but that the family's oral history attributed to the variety's original development in a semi-arid agricultural region prior to its introduction to Montana in 1911. The paragraph noted that this kind of long-term, undocumented, farmer-maintained selection represented a significant and under-recognized source of genetic diversity for traits like extreme water use efficiency, that modern breeding programs focused on different priorities for most of the 20th century had not selected for, and in some cases had inadvertently selected against. Earl had read this paragraph when Yusuf sent him an advance copy of the paper. He had read it twice. He had called Yusuf. He had said, "It says inadvertently selected against." Yusuf had said yes. He had said, "What does that mean exactly?" Yusuf had said, "It means that for most of the 20th century, breeding programs were selecting for yield under good conditions. And some of the traits that make your wheat efficient under bad conditions may have been unintentionally bred out of the varieties that were optimized for yield." He had said, not because anyone wanted to lose those traits, because nobody was testing for them, so nobody noticed when varieties that had them got replaced by varieties that didn't. Earl had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "So my neighbors switching to the modern varieties?" Yusuf had said, "They were responding to the conditions that mattered most of the time, in most years. That was a reasonable thing to do." He had said, "But it meant that traits like the ones your variety has became rarer across the broader wheat population, because fewer farms were growing varieties that had them." Earl had said, "And now you're saying those traits matter again, for a different reason." Yusuf had said, "For a very different reason, but yes." Earl had been quiet for a longer moment. He had said, "My grandfather kept this wheat because he'd seen what happened when the rain didn't come in a place far from here, and he wasn't going to be caught without something that could survive that again." He had said, "That's all it ever was. A man who'd been scared once, making sure he had what he needed if it happened again." He had said, "It's strange to hear that turned into something about space travel." Yusuf had said, "It's the same trait, though, the same underlying biology, surviving when water is scarce." He had said, "Your grandfather's fear in 1911 and a mission planner's calculation about a lunar greenhouse in 2030, those aren't as different as they sound. They're both about the same problem, not having enough water and needing the crop to make it anyway." Earl had said, "That's what I told you when you first got here." Yusuf had said, "I know, you were right." The local response in Hill County, once the story became known, first through the university's press release, then through a wire service pickup that ran in regional papers, then through a longer feature that a Montana Public Radio reporter did on Earl specifically, had been, in Earl's account of it, about what you'd expect, except backwards. For 40 years, the local conversation about Earl's wheat had been, "Why does Earl keep growing that old stuff when everyone else has moved on?" After the NASA story, the conversation became for a while, "Did you hear NASA is using Earl's wheat?" The content of the conversation had inverted, but Earl noted, with some amusement, that the structure had not. It was still a conversation other people were having about his farming decisions, just with the valence reversed. His neighbor Kurt Eisinger, whose family had farmed adjacent land for 3 generations, and who had been, over the decades, one of the more frequent sources of the "leaving yield on the table" commentary, had come by in the fall after the story broke. He had stood in Earl's yard for a while, not quite getting to the point, the way men in that part of Montana sometimes took a while to get to a point that mattered to them. Eventually, he had said, 40 years I've been telling you that wheat was a mistake." Earl had said, "About that, yeah." Kurt had said, "I want to be clear, I'm not apologizing." He had said it almost like a joke, but Earl understood he meant it seriously underneath the joke. Earl had said, "I wouldn't expect you to. You were right for what mattered to you." Kurt had said, "Was I though?" Earl had said, "In a good year, your yield's better than mine. That's just true. It was true 40 years ago, and it's true now. Kurt had said, yeah, but. He had stopped. He had looked out at Earl's stubble fields. He had said, I've had 3 bad years out of the last 10. Real bad. The kind where you're doing the math on whether you make it to next season. He had said, you've had the same 3 bad years, and you made a crop, every one of them. Not a great crop, but a crop. He had said, I think about that more than I used to. Earl had said, it's not a competition, Kurt. It never was. We farmed different ground in the same place, more or less. And we made different bets a long time ago, based on what we each cared about most. He had said, you cared about the good years. My grandfather cared about the bad ones. He had said, neither one of us was wrong. We were just answering different questions. Kurt had nodded slowly. He had said, well, he had said, anyway. He had looked like he might say something else, and then hadn't, and had gotten back in his truck and driven off. The way conversations between neighbors in that part of Montana sometimes ended. Not resolved exactly, but registered. Something had been said that both men would remember, without either of them needing to revisit it directly again. Earl had kept a small amount of seed from the 1912 planting line in a separate container in his seed storage for decades. Not the bulk seed he replanted from each year, but a smaller reserve, the way his father had kept one and his grandfather before him. A kind of insurance against the possibility that something happened to the main seed stock in any given year. He had never needed to use it. It existed because Henrik had started the practice in 1912, the year after he arrived, and Walter had continued it, and Earl had continued it, the same way the family had continued growing the wheat itself, not because anyone had decided at any point that this was an important tradition to maintain, but because it was simply what you did with seed that mattered, and nobody had ever decided to stop. When the USDA germplasm program had requested a deposit sample, Earl had given them seed from this reserve, not the current year's harvest, but seed that had been in the reserve for several years, rotated through periodically the way the reserve had always been managed to ensure viability. He had said to Yusuf, when he handed over the sample, this is from the same line my grandfather kept a reserve of, starting the year after he got here. He had said, I don't know exactly how many generations of reserve seed separate this from what was in his sack in 1911. Probably not many. We rotated, but we always plant from the reserve into the rotation and take new reserve from the harvest, so it's not like the original seed has been sitting in a jar for 112 years. He had said, but it's the same line, continuously. He had said, that's what your germplasm collection is getting, not a museum piece, a line that's been alive and growing and reproducing for 112 years, the whole time, without a break. Yusuf had said, that's exactly what makes it valuable. A frozen sample from 1912 would tell us what the variety was in 1912. A continuously cultivated line tells us what the variety is now, after 112 years of growing in this specific place, under this specific management. He had said, it's been adapting slightly the whole time, to your field specifically, even while staying recognizably the same variety. Earl had said, is that good or bad for what you need? Yusuf had said, it's good. It means the variety is robust. It's maintained its core characteristics across a century of natural variation in growing conditions, while also being, in a small way, specifically adapted to dryland Montana. He had said, for our purposes, that robustness is part of the value. A variety that can maintain its essential traits across a century of real-world variation is more likely to perform reliably in conditions we haven't tested yet. Because real-world variation is itself a kind of stress testing. Earl had thought about this. He had said, so the 112 years weren't just keeping it the same. They were testing it. Yusuf had said, yes, every year was a test, even though nobody was thinking of it that way. He had said, and it passed, every year, in the sense that mattered most. It kept producing enough to be worth replanting. Earl had said, "That's the only test that ever mattered, as far as my family was concerned." He had said, "Did it make a crop? Every year, did it make a crop?" He had said, 112 years of that question, answered the same way every time, even in the bad years. Earl's grandson Mark, who was 31 and had been farming alongside Earl for the past 6 years, with the understanding that he would eventually take over the operation, had been present for some of the conversations with Yusuf and had followed the subsequent research with more attention than Earl himself had, partly because Mark had a degree in agronomy from Montana State and understood the technical details of the water use efficiency research more readily than Earl did, and partly because Mark was the generation who would be making decisions about the operation's future, including decisions about which varieties to grow for the next several decades. Mark had asked Earl, at some point during the year the story was developing, whether any of it changed how Mark should think about the operation going forward. Earl had thought about this carefully, because it was, in his view, the most important question anyone had asked him about any of it. He had said, "I don't think the NASA part changes anything about how you should farm. That's not really about farming. That's about a research program finding a variety useful for a purpose that has nothing to do with growing wheat in Montana." He had said, "What should matter to you is the same thing that's always mattered. Does it make a crop every year, including the bad years?" He had said, "That question doesn't care whether NASA is interested. It was the right question in 1912, and it's the right question now, and it'll be the right question after both of us are gone." Mark had said, "But if the variety is valuable now," Earl had said, "it was always valuable to us. The fact that someone else figured out it's valuable to them too, for a different reason, that's good. It might mean there's a market for seed, eventually, beyond just our own replanting. That could matter to the operation financially." He had said, "But it doesn't change the underlying decision. The underlying decision is still, do you want wheat that's reliable in a bad year, even if it's not the best in a good year?" He had said, "That was Henrik's decision, and it was my decision, and it'll be your decision when it's your turn." He had said, "I can't make that decision for you. I can just tell you what I decided and why, the same way Henrik told my father, and my father told me." Mark had said, "And if I decide differently?" Earl had looked at him for a moment. He had said, "Then you decide differently, and that's your decision to make, and I'd want to understand your reasons the way I understood mine." He had said, "But I'll tell you what I'd ask you to do, if you do decide to grow something else." Mark had said, "What?" Earl had said, "Keep the reserve seed going anyway, even if you're not planting it in the main rotation. Even if it's just a few pounds in a jar that gets rotated every few years, so it stays viable." He had said, "Henrik started that the year after he got here, and it's been going for 112 years, and it didn't cost much to maintain, and it turned out 112 years later to matter to people working on something Henrik never could have imagined." He had said, "I'm not saying keep growing it because of NASA. I'm saying you never know what 112 years of this still works turns out to be useful for. Keep that option alive, even if you're not using it right now. It doesn't cost much, and it might turn out to matter someday, for a reason nobody currently knows." Mark had been quiet for a while. He had said, "That's not really advice about farming." Earl had said, "No." He had said, "It's advice about not closing doors you don't have to close." He had said, Henrik didn't know what his sack of seed would turn out to be useful for, beyond getting his family through the next winter. He just knew it had worked before, in a hard place, and he wasn't going to throw it away just because the new place looked easier. He had said, turned out the new place wasn't always easier either, and the seed mattered again, and it kept mattering, on and off, for over a century, in ways nobody could have predicted at any point along the way. He had looked out at the stubble fields, the mountains blue on the horizon, the specific gold-brown of late summer on the high plains that had not changed in its essentials since Henrik had first seen it in 1911 and had decided, for reasons that had made sense to him then, and that had kept making sense in different ways for everyone who came after him, that this was where the sack of seed would go into the ground. He had said, "That's the whole of it, really. Peep what works. Don't assume you know everything it's good for. Let the next person find out the rest." Mark had nodded. The reserve seed was in the seed shed, in its jar, rotated most recently the previous fall, viable for several more years before it would need rotating again. It would be there, the way it had been there for 112 years, whether or not anyone needed it. That was the whole of it. Earl Voss had arrived at the rail siding nearest his homestead claim in May 1912, with his wife, Greta, 2 young children, and the possessions that had survived the journey from a village near the Volga, that he never named in any document Earl had access to, and rarely named in conversation even within the family. Not because of secrecy exactly, but because the village no longer existed in any form that made naming it meaningful, and Henrik had developed over the decades a habit of referring to it simply as where we were from, which was both accurate and, in its way, complete. The Volga German communities had been established in the late 1700s, when Catherine the Great had invited German-speaking settlers to develop agricultural land along the Volga River, offering them religious freedom, exemption from military service, and local self-governance, terms that had attracted tens of thousands of settlers from various German-speaking regions who had established farming communities that maintained their language, customs, and agricultural practices largely independent of the surrounding Russian population for over a century. The agricultural practices that mattered most for the purposes of Earl's wheat were the ones that had developed in response to the Volga region's climate, which received considerably less annual precipitation than most of the German-speaking regions the original settlers had come from. The settlers had brought wheat varieties from Western and Central Europe initially, but over generations, through both deliberate selection and the simple attrition of varieties that failed in dry years, the communities had developed strains that performed reliably under conditions significantly drier than what European wheat-growing regions typically experienced. By the late 1800s, the privileges that had attracted the original settlers had been progressively withdrawn. Military exemptions ended, local governance autonomy reduced, and the broader political situation in the Russian Empire becoming increasingly difficult for German-speaking minority communities. Emigration from the Volga German communities to North America had begun in the 1870s and continued through the early 1900s, with the largest waves coming in the years immediately before the First World War, as the community situation became progressively more precarious and as news of available land in the American and Canadian plains, land with climate conditions that, while not identical to the Volga region, were similar enough that Volga German farmers often performed exceptionally well on land that other settlers had found marginal, spread through the communities via letters from earlier emigrants. Henrik had left in 1911, at 26, with Greta and their first child, traveling by train to a Baltic port and then by ship to New York, and then by train again to Montana, where an earlier emigrant from a neighboring Volga village had written that there was good land available for homestead claims, and that the climate, while harsh, was the kind of harsh that Volga German wheat could handle. He had brought what he could carry. Most of it had been the practical necessities of starting a homestead: tools, a small amount of money, documents. But he had also brought, in a small cloth sack sewn by Greta specifically for the purpose, seed wheat from the variety his family had been growing for at least 3 generations that he knew of, and likely longer. A variety that had no name beyond what the family called it, which translated roughly to "our wheat," and which Earl, 112 years later, still sometimes called by the English equivalent when he was talking about it informally. Our wheat, distinct from the wheat, which could refer to any wheat, including his neighbors. The first few years on the Montana homestead had been, by Henrik's account, as it had been passed down through the family, extremely difficult. The specific difficulty of any homestead claim in that period and region, compounded by the fact that Henrik and Greta were establishing themselves with very little capital, in a place where the nearest other Volga German families were several days' travel away, in a climate that, while similar in its dryness to what they'd had known, was also considerably colder in winter than the Volga region had been. The wheat had been planted in the fall of 1912, the first full growing season after their arrival. The 1912-1913 winter had been, by the standards of the homesteading families in that part of Hill County, a difficult one. A dry fall followed by a winter with limited snow cover, conditions that several of the homestead claims established by American and Scandinavian settlers in the surrounding area had not survived, in the sense that several families had abandoned their claims after that first winter, judging the land unworkable. Henrik's wheat had survived. Not spectacularly. Earl, telling this part of the story, was careful to note that the family account did not describe the 1913 harvest as exceptional, just as adequate, which, in the context of a winter that had broken several neighboring claims, was itself notable. Henrik had written, in a letter to relatives still in the Volga region, a letter that had, remarkably, survived and been passed down through the family. Translated at some point from the original German dialect into English by Walter in the 1950s. The translation itself, now an artifact that Earl kept along with the few other family documents that had survived multiple homestead moves and a century of Montana weather. Henrik had written, "The land here is hard in the same way our land was hard, though colder. The wheat from home does well here, better than the wheat the American neighbors brought, which failed for several of them this year. I am glad we brought it. I have set aside seed beyond what we will plant, in case this year's harvest is poor and we need a reserve. I will continue this every year while we are able, because seed is the one thing that, once lost, cannot be easily replaced, and I do not want to be in a position again where I do not have what I need because I did not plan for the possibility of not having it." This letter, written in 1913 by a 28-year-old man who had crossed an ocean the previous year with very little and was facing a Montana winter that had already broken several of his neighbors, was, as far as Earl was concerned, the actual origin of everything that had happened since, including the conversation with Yusuf Bakr 110 years later. Earl had shown Yusuf this letter, in translation, during one of Yusuf's visits. Yusuf had read it carefully. He had said, he had paused, looking for the right word. He had said, "This is essentially a description of risk management for a closed system with limited resupply options." He had said, "That's what we do in the space program. We plan for the possibility of not having what we need, because resupply isn't an option or is extremely limited." He had said, "Your great-grandfather was describing the same problem in 1913 on a homestead in Montana for the same underlying reason. He'd already experienced what it was like to be in a place where what you needed couldn't be easily replaced, and he wasn't going to be caught that way again." Earl had said, "That's what I keep telling people. It's the same problem. Different places, different scales, same problem." He had said, not having enough of something critical and needing to plan for that, because you can't just go get more. The reserve seed practice that Henrik had started in 1913 had continued, with only one significant interruption, for 112 years. The interruption had been during the early 1930s, during the worst of the drought years that devastated the northern plains during that period. Years when even Henrik's wheat, bred for dry conditions, but not for conditions as extreme as the early 1930s northern plains experienced, had produced harvests too small to both plant the next year's crop and maintain a separate reserve. Henrik had made the decision, during those years, to use the reserve seed as part of the planting stock rather than maintaining it separately, because the alternative, not having enough seed to plant a crop at all. He had told Walter, who was a teenager during this period and who told Earl decades later, that this had been one of the hardest decisions of his farming life. Not because using the reserve seed caused any immediate problem, but because it meant, for those years, that the family no longer had the margin that Henrik had specifically created in 1913 as protection against exactly the kind of situation they now found themselves in. The margin had been used up. They were back to having only what they were currently planting, with nothing held back. Henrik had rebuilt the reserve as soon as harvests allowed. By the late 1930s, the practice had resumed, and it had continued without interruption from that point through Earl's tenure and into the present. Earl had told this part of the story to Yusuf with a specific emphasis that Yusuf had noted in his own records of the conversations, because it illustrated something about the variety's history that the genetic data alone could not show. The variety had been tested not just by ordinary seasonal variation, but by an extreme drought event, severe enough to consume the family's entire seed reserve, and had still recovered, had still produced enough in the years immediately following to both replant and rebuild the margin that had been depleted. Yusuf had said, "That's actually significant data, in a sense. It tells us the variety doesn't just perform well under moderate deficit conditions. It can recover from a severe stress event without losing its essential characteristics. A lot of stress-tolerant varieties are tolerant up to a point and then experience permanent yield decline after a sufficiently severe event. This one apparently didn't." Earl had said, "I don't know if anyone in my family ever thought of it that way. They just thought it came back." He had said that's what mattered. Did it come back? Mark had been present for the conversation about the 1930s drought and the depleted reserve, and had asked Earl afterward whether the family had ever considered, during that period or at any point since, switching to a different variety, given that even our wheat, as resilient as it was, had been pushed to the edge of what it could handle during the worst drought years. Earl had said, "I asked my father that once." He had said, "What did he say?" Earl had said, he said Henrik had considered it, briefly. During the worst of it, when the reserve was gone, and the harvests were small, and everyone around them was failing or switching to whatever the Extension Service was recommending at the time, which changed every few years, as people tried different things to cope with the drought. He had said, Henrik looked at what the Extension Service was recommending, and he looked at what his neighbors who'd switched were getting, and he decided that what he had was still better than what was being offered, even though what he had wasn't doing well either. He had said nothing was doing well. The question wasn't whether his wheat was doing well. The question was whether it was doing better than the alternatives, in the conditions that actually existed, rather than the conditions the extension recommendations were designed for. He had said, and it was, not by a huge margin in those years, but it was. Mark had said, so he stuck with it, because the alternatives weren't actually better, even though his variety wasn't doing great either. Earl had said, that's right. He had said, people sometimes think the choice was between our wheat, which works, and something else, which doesn't. That's not quite it. During the worst years, nothing worked great. The choice was between our wheat, which works less badly than the alternatives, and switching to something that's optimized for conditions we don't currently have, on the theory that maybe those conditions will come back. He had said, Henrik bet that the conditions he was currently in, bad, were more likely to continue, at least in the near term, than the conditions the new recommendations were designed for, good. He had said he was right for those years. The drought continued for several more years after that. Mark had said, and after the drought ended, Earl had said, by then my father said, it just didn't seem worth changing. The wheat had gotten them through the worst of it. The reserve was being rebuilt. There wasn't an obvious reason to switch, and there was the accumulated experience of 40 years of knowing exactly how this variety behaved, in this place, under this management. He had said switching would have meant starting that experience over with something new for an advantage that, in good years, was real, but that nobody in the family had ever experienced as the thing that mattered most. He had said what mattered most was always, did it make a crop in the bad years? The story that ran on Montana Public Radio in the fall, after the agronomy paper's publication, had included an interview segment with Earl that ran longer than the rest of the piece. The reporter, a woman named Diane Holt, who had grown up on a ranch in eastern Montana herself, and who Earl had found easy to talk to in a way he generally did not find easy with reporters, had asked him, near the end of the interview, what he wanted people to take away from the story. Earl had thought about it for a while, long enough that Diane, listening back to the recording later, had left the pause in the broadcast version because she felt it was part of the answer. He had said, "I think people are going to hear this and think it's a story about an old variety turning out to be useful for something nobody expected." And that's true, as far as it goes. He had said, but the part I'd want people to sit with is, Henrik didn't do anything special. He didn't have a plan for any of this. He had a problem, not enough water where he came from, and not enough water where he was going. And he had a solution to that problem that he'd inherited from people before him, and he kept the solution going because it kept solving the problem year after year in front of him on his own land. He had said, that's it. That's the whole thing. He didn't preserve anything for the future in the sense of thinking about the future. He solved the problem he had every year using what had worked the previous years, and he made sure he'd have what he needed if things got worse, because things had gotten worse before, where he came from, and he wasn't going to be unprepared for that again. He had said, 112 years later, it turns out the same solution is useful for a completely different problem, on a completely different scale, that Henrik couldn't have imagined in 1,000 years. He had said, but it's not like he was preparing for that. He was just taking care of the actual problem in front of him, the way he knew how, using what he had. And he kept doing that every year, and so did my father, and so have I. He had said, I think that's actually the useful part of the story, if there is one. Not, isn't it amazing that this old thing turned out to matter for space travel? More like, take care of the actual problem in front of you, using what you know works, and keep doing that, year after year. You don't need to know what else it might be good for. You just need it to keep working for the thing you actually need it for right now. He had said, everything else is something somebody else figures out later, if they need to. That's not your job. Your job is, does it make a crop this year? Diane had asked. And if it doesn't, Earl had said, then you figure out why, and you do something different next year. He had said, but you don't throw away something that's been working, just because something else might work better in conditions you don't currently have. He had said, that's the mistake people make, I think, assuming that better in some other conditions means better, period. It doesn't. It means better in those conditions. If those aren't your conditions, it's not better. It's just different for a situation you're not in. He had said Henrik knew what conditions he was in. I know what conditions I'm in. That's most of it, really. Knowing what conditions you're actually in and having something that works in those conditions and not getting talked out of it by people who are describing a different set of conditions. The interview had ended there. Diane had left the pause in. The reserve seed jar was in the seed shed, on a shelf that Earl had built himself in the 1970s to replace the shelf his father had built, which had replaced whatever Henrik had originally used, none of which Earl had any record of beyond the practice itself. The jar, on the shelf, rotated periodically, containing seed from a line that had been growing in that ground without interruption except for the few years in the 1930s when the margin itself had been the casualty rather than the crop, for 112 years. Mark had asked, the same fall the radio piece ran, whether Earl ever thought about what would happen to the jar, and the practice, and the variety, after Earl was no longer the one making the decisions. Earl had said, that's not really my decision to make. He had said, I can tell you what I think, and I can tell you what I do, but the decision about what happens after I'm not making decisions anymore belongs to whoever's making decisions then. He had said, that's how it's always worked. Henrik didn't get a vote on what my father did. My father didn't get a vote on what I did. He had said what they got was they did what they thought was right, for as long as they were the ones doing it, and they told the next person why, as clearly as they could, and then it was up to the next person. He had said, "I've told you why. Henrik wrote it down more or less in 1913, and I've told you the rest." He had said, "What you do with that is up to you. I'm not going to be disappointed if you decide something different makes more sense for the operation going forward." Things change. Conditions change. What worked for 112 years might not be the right answer for the next 50. Mark had said, "But you'd want me to at least understand why it worked before I changed it." Earl had said, "Yes." He had said, "That's the only thing I'd ask. Not that you keep it, that you understand it, well enough to know what you'd be giving up if you decided to give it up." He had said, "Henrik understood what he had because he'd seen what it was like not to have it. I understand what I have because Henrik and my father told me clearly enough that I could understand it without having to live through what they lived through." He had said, "I want you to understand it the same way, clearly enough that whatever you decide, you're deciding with full information, not just because something newer looks better, and nobody told you what you'd be trading away." He had said, "That's all any of us can really do for the people who come after. Tell them clearly enough what we know so they can decide for themselves, with the same information we had, plus whatever new information they have that we didn't." He had looked toward the seed shed, visible from where they were standing. The jar on its shelf inside, rotated most recently the previous fall, viable for several more years. He had said, "Henrik did that for my father. My father did that for me." He had said, "I'm doing it for you." He had said, "That's the whole chain. Nobody in it has to do what the person before them did. They just have to understand it well enough to make their own choice." The wheat was in the bins, harvested, the protein content tested and recorded the way it had been tested and recorded every year for as long as anyone had been keeping records. A hard red winter wheat, high protein, modest yield, the same variety essentially that had come across an ocean in a cloth sack in 1911, that had survived a winter that broke several neighboring claims in 1913, that had been depleted and rebuilt during the drought of the 1930s, that had been quietly, unremarkably grown on the same 1,100 acres for decades while neighbors switched to other varieties, and that had, in 2023, turned out to be the best water use efficiency result recorded in 11 years of a NASA research program studying how to grow food on the moon. None of which changed, in any way that mattered to the actual operation, what would happen on this land next spring. The wheat would go in the ground. The reserve would be checked and rotated if it needed it. The question that mattered, did it make a crop, would be asked again, the way it had been asked every year for 112 years, and answered the way it had been answered every year, in whatever way that year's conditions produced. That was the whole of it.